But I think it's a misunderstanding of the risks that need to be taken into consideration, because for the land designated for a Palestinian state is such that you control all of the following: virtually all Israel's airfields, military and civilian, including the only international airport, civilian harbors and naval bases, almost the entire ground transport system, that's road and rail, major infrastructure systems and installations like power generation, power transmission, communications, sweet water system, vital centers of civilian government and military command, and 80% of the civilian population and 80% of the economic activity. Now, all of these will be in range of weapons being used today from territory relinquished to the Palestinians. So this is nothing that can be dismissed as right-wing scaremongering. This is past experience. Now, clearly, if you're pro-Israeli, or to be pro-Israeli, you would admit that if this territory was in the hands of radical Islamists, this would be a bad result. So I can't really understand how people who know that regime change is no longer a theoretical option, but has actually happened in Gaza. So I can't understand people who, even if they happen to believe that you can find a mythical moderate Palestinian who's prepared to sign an agreement with you in good faith, how can they guarantee his continued incumbency? In fact, the very fact that he signs an agreement with a perfidious agreement with the Zionist entity could be the impetus for him being replaced. So you have a situation whereby you have Peace Now and the left wing endorsing a policy which they admit may precipitate a situation which they admit would make Israel's security untenable, and which they admit they have no way of preventing it. Why would they want to do this? This seems to be a total eclipse of common sense and a total abdication of moral responsibility. Well, basically, the peace process is structured today and is probably motivated by policy makers' awareness of a demographic problem, basically seems to be geared towards trying to address a severe demographic problem by generating an impossible geographic problem. Because for Israel to survive as the nation state of the Jewish people, it has to address two imperatives: the demographic imperative and the geographic imperative. You have to ensure a long-term dominant Jewish majority and minimal conditions for security of that majority. What the present process is doing is putting the focus solely on the demographic issue and totally ignoring the geographic issue. So basically their solution is, in order to deal with the demographic problem, which I don't want to downplay its importance, is by generating a situation which geographically will make Israel untenable.
And what is that risk, that geographic risk, that's part of all the discussions of a Palestinian state?
Well, as I said before, it will give anyone who controls the territory complete control of Israel's civilian population, its military infrastructure and its civilian infrastructure. It will be impossible to maintain any sort of social or economic routine. Well, put it this way, it's highly plausible that it will be impossible to maintain such a routine. So the question is, why precipitate such a situation, and never mind putting Israelis in risk, but think of all the Palestinians that will be at risk if Israel has to respond coercively to threats from the mountains just east of Tel Aviv. But it doesn't really even have to be a large-scale operation to make life in Israel untenable. if you have once or twice a week a rocket landing on the runway of the international airport, that will cut off Israel's international air contacts completely. Because planes won't be landing there, and insurance companies won't be insuring planes landing there. So that would mean you basically give the Palestinians either the regime that you've signed an agreement with, or their opponents, because you don't need a state actor to perpetrate acts like that. You can just have a small rogue band of dissidents shooting a mortar bomb or a Qassam rocket that endangers incoming planes, for planes not to land, especially all the international planes. So, you know, there's so many incidents that could be precipitated far short of a major onslaught on Israel that would make Israeli economic life and Israeli social life completely untenable under these conditions.
But what about those who claim that having a peace treaty with the Palestinian Authority would preclude those kinds of attacks?
Well, you really need a giant leap of faith to make that the basis of your policy. You've seen the past precedent. You've seen the exit of Israel from Gaza. We've seen that even though all the settlements were completely razed off the face of the earth, this hasn't generated any peace. And this completely exposes the myth that the settlements are an obstacle to peace. Because in Gaza, the settlements were completely destroyed, apart from the synagogues, which the Palestinians later destroyed and defiled. And that hasn't brought any peace. Every time Israel in recent history has relinquished territory to some Arab authority, it's been used as a platform to attack Israel. It happened when Israel withdrew unilaterally from Lebanon in the north. It happened when Israel withdrew from Gaza. And it's only been Israeli coercive actions within defensive shield and the Israeli security barrier which has prevented the same sort of situation from arising in the east.
So, how tenable is the notion of creating a two-state solution, pragmatically?
Well, I think it's totally untenable. But even if I'm wrong, I think it's such a great risk that it would be irresponsible to adopt it.
And is that a message for Washington?
Well, I think first of all it's the message for Jerusalem. It's the message that Jerusalem should first of all internalize and then transmit it to Washington. I mean, you can't really expect Washington to be more resolute, more assertive, more hawkish than the Israeli government. So I think this is a message that first of all has to be adopted by Israelis and Israeli governments and Israeli policymakers and leaders before we can actually expect the Americans to embrace this as a matter of policy.
And so, what do you propose Jerusalem, the Knesset, and Washington should be approaching in their strategies for a safe solution for Israel and a just solution for the Palestinians?
You know, first of all, if you're talking about Israeli security, Israel has to control the territory in what's known as the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion as expressed by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in a document that was handed to the U.S. President after the Six-Day War, and a document which has been endorsed later by senior American figures like Eugene Roster, who was the American diplomat who basically was in charge of the formulation of Resolution 242, and states specifically that that resolution never really intended Israel to withdraw to the Green Line, and that all the studies of Israeli security show that Israel has to hold the high ground in Judea and Samaria. And this would make a Palestinian state untenable. So, first of all, it depends what your point of departure is. If Israel's security is your point of departure, Israel has to hold that territory. If it holds that territory, the Palestinian state is untenable. So the question is then, what is a just solution for the Palestinians? I think it's very easy to show that Palestinian claims to nationalism Palestinian claims to being a national entity are bogus. They're bogus both on a theoretical level and they're bogus on a practical level. Not because I say so, but because they say so and because history says so. Palestinians have proved themselves to be, rather than a cohesive, coherent national entity, an amalgam of bands, clans, and gangs who are very hostile to each other, and the only really unifying factor is their enmity towards Israel. So it depends what you mean by a just solution. I believe a just solution would be to help the Palestinians build a better life for themselves elsewhere, because Palestinian state, I think anyone with an iota of intellectual integrity knows that a Palestinian state would be an element for destabilization rather than stabilization. And so if you're talking about justice, not on a political level, but on a humanitarian level, I think the solution lies in finding ways to allow Palestinians to build a better life for them and their families elsewhere.
Are you speaking in terms of the classic political population exchange?
It's not about population exchange. No, I'm not talking about political level at all. Once you realize that the Palestinian claim to a nation state is merely a device for undermining the Jewish claim to a nation state, then the whole narrative becomes illegitimate. So I think the solution lies in depoliticizing the situation, putting the political aspirations, because they are bogus, because they're spurious, aside, and focusing on the humanitarian plight of the Palestinians, which is something that can be addressed with money. So something that can be addressed with money. And well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that Palestinian nationalism as such is bogus. It's bogus on a theoretical level, and it's certainly been proved bogus on the practical level. Palestinians have proved themselves not to be a coherent, cohesive national entity that's capable of setting up any kind of productive, stable civil society. They've proved themselves to be an amalgam of bands and clans and gangs who have great hostility for each other, and the only unifying factor seems to be this abiding hostility and enmity towards Israel. So the solution, if you're interested in a secure Israel and a stable Middle East, the solution lies in delegitimizing the Palestinian political narrative and focusing on the humanitarian plight of individual Palestinians, which is something that can be solved with money. You must remember that the Palestinians basically have been betrayed by their leadership for well over a century. They've been used as a political pawn in the struggle of the Arab world against Israel, and to diffuse the situation, first of all have to recognize that the Palestinians are the fuse. So if you want to diffuse the situation, you have to take the fuse out. And the fuse means basically addressing Palestinians' humanitarian plight as individuals, to depoliticize the situation, to focus on the humanitarian aspects. This is something that can be addressed with money, and this is something that can help the Palestinians create a better life for themselves and for their families elsewhere, and extricate them from the fate that's been imposed upon them by a corrupt, cruel leadership.
How do you mean could be addressed through money?
Well, I would suggest approaching the Palestinian issue with three separate elements. The first element, well, put it this way, these elements, I believe, are completely consistent with politically correct, liberal political doctrine. And the plan would be comprised of three elements. Two of the elements involve eliminating ethnic discrimination against the Palestinians, and the third would involve allowing Palestinian individuals the freedom of choice to determine their fate. As far as the first two go, the initial element relates to the Palestinians as refugees. All the refugees on the face of the earth are under the auspices of an organization called the UN High Commission for Refugees, except the Palestinians. This basically is the core of the problem. The Palestinian organization, which is devoted only to the Palestinians, is called UNRWA. These two organizations have different definitions of who is a refugee and different mandates relating to how to deal with them. According to the High Commission definition, which is valid for all the refugees on the face of the globe, as I said, except for Palestinians, including earthquakes, tsunamis, famine and political persecution, the number of refugees decreases over time. According to the UNRWA definition, the number of refugees increases over time. The High Commission has a mandate to find permanent solutions for refugees in their place of residence or in third-party countries. UNRWA only has a mandate for taking care of the humanitarian needs. By the way, the High Commission deals with Palestinian refugees if they're not displaced from Israel and Palestine. If there were Palestinians who were displaced from Iraq, for instance, that falls under the High Commission. They find them permanent solutions. They found permanent solutions for them in South America and in North America. So if you take the UNRWA definition, which involves an increasing population of refugees, and the UNRWA mandate, which doesn't allow a permanent solution for this population, you quickly come to the conclusion that UNRWA is an organization that perpetuates the problem that it's supposed to solve. And without eliminating UNRWA, there will be no solution to the Palestinian problem, because it perpetuates the narrative of return and the enmity towards Israel. So that's, by the way, Canada has just stopped funding UNRWA. Arab countries don't fund it at all. And Canada stopped funding it precisely for the reasons that I've mentioned. So once you morph UNRWA into the High Commission, this will mean that many Arabs in the Arab world, many Palestinians in the Arab world, will not be receiving humanitarian aid. This problem must be addressed by setting up a very assertive and determined campaign to allow Palestinians in the Arab world to be treated like everyone else in the Arab world has been treated, allow them to acquire citizenship and to stop the discrimination against them. Today the situation is Palestinians are fiercely discriminated against in the Arab world in terms of employment opportunities, freedom of movement, the ability to own property and citizenship.
In which kind of countries?
Virtually all Arab countries in different degrees. For instance, I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia recently, a couple of years ago, instituted legislation which would allow non-Saudi residents in the kingdom to acquire citizenship in a more accelerated fashion. This was valid for all the nationalities in Saudi Arabia except the Palestinians. And the explicit reason given for that was that if Palestinians were allowed to acquire citizenship in their countries of residence, there'd be no one to go back to Palestine. Okay, so this shows that those who are preserving more zealously the issue of Palestinian nationalism are not the Palestinians, but the non-Palestinians. In fact, many surveys have shown that the Palestinians really desire citizenship of the countries they're residents in. And this has been rejected basically on the basis that this would spell the death knell for the right of return. So the second stage would be an assertive diplomatic campaign, first of all to expose the ethnic discrimination against Palestinians in the Arab world, and to pressure Arab governments to end this discrimination and allow Palestinians to acquire citizenship, which they themselves claim they desire. The third element would relate to the Palestinians under areas which are under Israeli, in areas which are under Israeli administration. And here I suggest offering the Palestinians very generous relocation and rehabilitation loans that will allow them to choose their country of their country of choice, their destination of choice, and build better lives for themselves and their families there. Now, statistical evidence indicates that many Palestinians, in fact, a huge majority of Palestinians, would in fact embrace such an opportunity. And I can't understand what the downside is, because, let them decide if they want to. As I say, surveys that have been conducted show that there is a huge desire for many Palestinians to extricate themselves from the rather harsh realities in the Palestinian territories and build a better life for themselves and their families. Now, this would, of course, have distinct advantages for the host countries. I'll give you an example which may be unrealistic, but it's illustrative. That if all the Palestinians decided they would like to immigrate to Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, and Indonesia decided it was going to accept them, the net results of this measure would be that there would be a very small increase, percentage, of the Indonesian population, probably between 1 and 2%. Every single Palestinian breadwinner arriving at the gates of Indonesia would not be an impoverished refugee. It would have something approaching 1 century of GNP per capita in his pocket in Indonesian terms, equivalent to an American immigrant arriving at the gates of America with between $2 and $3 million. And the Indonesian economy would have an injection of capital of anything between 100 and 200 billion dollars. It sounds like win-win to me.
And where would that money come from?
Well, it would depend who would be on board, but basically, if this was spread over a decade and a half, Israel, with its GNP per capita, with its GNP of $150 billion today, could finance most of that on its own, even without international aid. If
hang on a second. You said it's
this solution were to acquire international legitimacy, it could be a fraction of a percent of the GNP per capita of the developed world. Certainly a fraction of what the US has already spent on what looks like to be a failed war against terror. Probably, at present rates, but probably less than a quarter of what's been spent on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's not a matter of funds. And by the way, when you ask about cost, the absolute cost is not really a factor. The question is, how does it compare to other alternatives? And I think it can be easily shown that the alternative of setting up a Palestinian state with all the infrastructure that has to be set up, and apparently at least the theoretical option of a Palestinian diaspora returning to Palestine, would not be much cheaper, if at all. Because why should bringing a large number of Palestinians from the diaspora back home be cheaper than bringing them from home to the diaspora? So it doesn't seem logical that it would be much cheaper. In fact, I believe it will probably be much more expensive, and it will solve nothing. At least if my suggestion is implemented, Israel will be secured as a nation state of the Jewish people. The Palestinian suffering and plight will be eliminated. Whereas if the two-state solution is implemented, you'll probably get a failed state with a disastrous economy and a great threat to Israel as a nation state. I think a two-state solution is a classic lose-lose situation. And what I'm suggesting is a classic win-win situation.
What about the Palestinian claims to East Jerusalem?
Well, the Palestinian claims to East Jerusalem are as unfounded as the claims to a state. I mean, if you believe that the Palestinians do not really have a legitimate claim to being a coherent national entity, then it certainly would disqualify their claim to having a capital for what is not a coherent national entity.
How about Muslim access to the Dome of the Rock?
Well, that's always been the case. The only time there hasn't been religious freedom has been when Jerusalem's been under Jordanian control, where Jews were barred from everything. Jewish sites were desecrated. Jewish cemeteries, the stones in Jewish cemeteries were uprooted and used for building material. Jewish synagogues were used as to herd goats in, or as public toilets. I think that anyone who brings up the question of religious freedom under the Israeli administration and questions it is either woefully misinformed or woefully misleading.
How at this point could the world convince the Palestinians to abandon their perceived national rights to stay there?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of the world. I think first of all, Israel should first of all it's a circus and put the case on the table. And secondly, I'm not trying to convince the Palestinian collective of anything. All I'm trying to convince is individual Palestinians to build a better life for themselves elsewhere. So the agreement that, or the solution or approach that I'm suggesting doesn't involve a political agreement with anyone. It's, as I say, the implementation is atomized. All I need to do is approach individual breadwinners and offer them compensation to leave and build a better life elsewhere. I don't really need to address the question at a formal level. I might have to do this for public relations, I might have to do this to acquire legitimacy for the solution, but the actual implementation can be conducted without any political agreement with the Palestinians.
How does this fit in the historical precedent for population transfer to create peace settlements after wars?
Well, it's not. I mean, population transfers have been implemented. For instance, mainly around the Turkish relationship. In Turkey, when the Armenians were driven out. But I think perhaps the most striking example is what's happened in Cyprus, where the two populations after bloody conflict were separated. Turkey has been condemned for this. There's much that you can condemn Turkey for, but at least their intervention in Cyprus stabilized the situation, which since 1970s has been stable. So I can't understand why ethnic mingling, which generates violence, should be considered in any way morally superior or morally desirable as compared to ethnic separation, which generates stability. But what I'm suggesting is distinctly different from what happened in Turkey. What I'm suggesting is a voluntary process of relocation, of rebuilding your lives, etc., etc. It's not a political process. The other transfer processes that are normally mentioned are either political / military ones. I'm not suggesting this. I'm suggesting this as a non-coercive option, as one which the political narrative is being delegitimized and focusing on the individuals and trying to improve their fate, trying to help them live a better life. So I'm trying to take the whole issue out of the realm of politics, out of the realm of coercive solutions, and allow this to be not dissolved, but to be not to be solved, but to be dissolved. So not solving the problem, it's dissolving the problem.
Could you envision it turning into a bidding war, that Arab governments who today keep the Palestinians alive as a thorn would then try to outbid the temptation to move with the temptation to remain?
What's stopping them doing it now? First of all, A, why aren't they doing it now? And B, Israel could deal with that because Israel can control the flows of money into country. You could say, well, okay, the Arabs will pay out any Israeli who arrives in London and claims it. But you must understand, today living in Israel today is not really such a harrowing experience. The GNP per capita in Israel today is reaching that of a first world country. Israelis are doing very well, thank you very much. Probably one of the strongest economies in the world. The restaurants are full, the trips abroad, people are buying new cars, people have got a lot of leisure time. And so offering the same amount of money to an Israeli is completely incomparable to the amount of what that would mean for a Palestinian. If we're talking about offering the Palestinians about $200,000 per family, a commensurate offer to an Israeli would have to be in the millions. Because if we're talking about the GNP per capita in the Palestinian areas being about $1,000 a month, or 1,000 something you're offering here, then you think between one and two centuries of GNP per capita. 1 or 2 centuries of GNP per capita in Israeli terms is $3 million. So to create a comparable inducement would be much more expensive. And I say, what's stopping them doing it today? The Arabs haven't showed themselves very, very eager to throw resources into solving the Palestinian problem. If you look at the funding of UNRWA, UNRWA is not funded by Arabs. The funding of the treatment of the Arab refugees is exclusively funded by Western governments, so perhaps Japan as well. But it's been Canada up to now, which is, as I said, Canada has stopped funding them. The US, the European Union, Scandinavian countries. These have been the big funders of UNRWA. So the Arabs have shown themselves pretty insensitive to the fate of the Palestinians when it comes to actually committing resources to dealing with it.
Suggesting is a paradigm shift, and today the empathy is, the public empathy is perhaps even in Israel is more on the side of the future of the Palestinians than on the future of the Israelis.
Well, I agree with you, it's a paradigm shift, but you're not going to solve the problem by trying to repeat failed solutions. It was Albert Einstein who defined insanity as trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And George Santayana, who defined fanaticism as redoubling your efforts and lost sight of the objective. So you know, it seems to me that that continuing along the same path has very distinct characteristics of either being insane fanaticism or fanatical insanity. But I agree with you. I think Israel has been terribly derelict in presenting its case. I think its case, the presentation of its case, has been hijacked by dysfunctional elites who have embraced the Palestinian narrative more than the Zionist narrative. And unless this changes, I think Israel's security is in great jeopardy. Israel faces two dangers. It faces the danger of the two-state solution, which will make it untenable geographically, and the normal presentation of the one-state solution, which will make it untenable demographically as the nation-state of the Jewish people. So you need to address both of these problems, which is precisely what I'm suggesting. But if Israel doesn't address this in a manner which I believe has to be addressed, as I said, along the lines that I'm suggesting, if you're looking for a non-coercive solution, I don't see any other solution that addresses both the demographics and the geography. But if you don't find a solution, I think Israel's future is in jeopardy. I think Israel today is sort of like the frog who's been put into cold water and the temperature being raised slowly and slowly, so the frog doesn't react to it until it's completely boiled. You know, if you look how Israel's position has been eroded over the years since the Oslo agreements, it's remarkable. In 1995, after the signature of Oslo II, after he'd been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Yitzhak Rabin in his last speech presented his vision of a final solution, which involved the rejection of a two-state solution, saying the Palestinian entity would have to be less than a state, endorsed the sovereignty of United Jerusalem in the broad sense of the word, claimed that the Jordan River would have to be Israel's security border, advocated incorporating settlements across the Green Line under Israeli sovereignty, and proposed establishing more settlements using the word like Gush Katif, which was dismantled in the disengagement. So you had this massive erosion of Israeli positions over the last decade and a half, and if this carries on, Israel will be pushed into a situation that will make its continued existence untenable.
But if the Israeli government is already in accord with the notion of a two-state solution as a solution to the conflict, what would it take to change that?
I think we'll put it this way. I mean, I think that proves. You have this old adage that war is too important to be left to the generals. I think politics is too important to be left to the politicians. And what you need is a very assertive restructuring of opinion inside civil society at first, because Israeli politicians don't set agendas. Israeli politicians adopt agendas, sometimes with great enthusiasm and sometimes with great reluctance. The people who set the agenda, the strategic agenda in Israel, have been civil society elites, those who control the media, those who control the legal system, and those who purport to control the academia. And what you need is to generate a challenge of competing elites for those positions and change the preferences, the perceived preferences of the relevant Israeli public opinion, so they will set a new agenda for the politicians.
Which institutions would this germinate from?
Well, given the existing record of existing institutions, I don't see that coming about, which is why I'm proposing setting up new institutions that can challenge and engage the opposing elites and their followers to discredit the present line that's been adopted and to start legitimizing a completely different and probably antithetical line for the conduct of national affairs.
Is the basis for this argument a religious argument?
Not at all. Not at all. It's got nothing to do with, well, I won't say it's got nothing to do with religion, but it's certainly not based on any religious claims at all. I think that any Israeli, whether they happen to be in favor of a halachic state or a postmodern liberal democracy, first of all need to secure the state. So I think the issue of security should unite the religious and the non-religious. You must understand, for Israel to be free from within, it has to be secure from without, because it's located in a sea of tyranny and theocracy, and unless it can ensure a secure existence for itself, it will not be able to maintain any liberal values, any semblance of liberal democratic society. So national security is a prerequisite for democracy. And I'm always amazed at liberals supporting the establishment of a Palestinian state, because the Palestinian state, with a very, very high degree of probability, is going to be the antithesis of the values being invoked for its establishment. It's going to be a state, or it's very likely to be a state, that will suppress its women, oppress its political dissidents, and repress its homosexuals. Even today, if honor killings of young women are not legally permitted, at least they're socially condoned. Political rivals are brutalized. Gays are summarily executed. So why would anyone who cherishes liberal values want to aid the establishment of something that is going to be the negation of all the values that they're supposed to cherish?
But if the Fatah party, which is more moderate than the Hamas party in Gaza, if Fatah were able to cut a deal, wouldn't that ensure more liberal society in the West Bank?
First of all, I don't think Fatah is more moderate. It's less religious. But if you look at the founding documents of the Fatah or of the Hamas, you'll say they're both totally committed to the total elimination of the Zionist entity. If anything, the Fatah constitution is even more explicit, which talks about eradicating every element of the Zionist entity and freeing Palestine. And when they say Palestine, you know what they mean, because the emblem includes the whole of Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So I think it's a dangerous misconception to portray the Fatah as more moderate. They're more secular. They're not more moderate. They have more or less the same aims.
What will happen if the peace process continues on the current path it's on?
Well, I think you'll see what's happened. Bad things will continue to happen, and Israel's existence will be continually undermined, and Israel's stature in the world will be continually eroded. I mean, if you look at the way Israel was treated in international community before the peace process and where it is today, it's night and day. I mean, there's been a huge delegitimization of Israel. The more and more it embraces concessionary policies, its image is more and more undermined. It's more and more demonized. And the same thing with security. The more concessions it offers, the less security it is. Every time Israel's made a concession, it's led to greater violence. And so what we have here is not a case where you have an adversary. If you make concessions to them, they recognize that it's a concession and feel somehow obligated to make some sort of reciprocal gesture. You have an adversary here. If you make a concession, he interprets that as weakness because he wouldn't make that concession if he was strong. And therefore, once you make the concession, you've signaled that you're weak, and that just precipitates more demands for more concessions.
And with Obama in office, do you think that that he could be a fair arbiter on behalf of maintaining Israeli safety?
I don't think so, but I don't think that's a defining factor. I think with far more assertive Israeli diplomacy, you could mobilize huge wells of support for Israel. There are hundreds of millions of Christian Zionists that could be mobilized. They're looking for leadership from Israel. They're not getting it. There are vast wells of support for Israel, both in America and outside America. And assertive Israeli diplomacy could mobilize public opinion that would make use of this kind of policy untenable, unpopular, and therefore would be abandoned.
You think there's too much momentum, inertia moving forward to change directions at this stage?
Well, I don't think there's much moving forward. It's at the moment it's all rhetoric and conceptual. There hasn't been that much movement on the ground since the first few years of Oslo. On the ground, things are more or less frozen. You've had, if there's been any movement, it's mainly been deterioration, like the Hamas taking over Gaza, and by the way, which is totally frozen the political process amongst the Palestinians. Elections have been postponed, put off, delayed. Even Abu Mazen is basically unconstitutionally installed as president, and that they know why. Because if there were elections today, there's a very good chance that the Hamas would take over, and totally unmask all this propaganda, which has been advanced by people like Tom Friedman in his latest article on the stock exchange in Nablus. So you've got all this intellectually dishonest spin, which is being produced to prevent reality being exposed.
Are you suggesting that the fix is in on this process?
Well, it depends what you mean by fix. I think that first of all you must decide what your point of departure is. If your point of departure is that Israel should continue to be the nation state of the Jewish people, then you must derive your policies which secure that outcome. If your point of departure is that you want to be seen as politically correct and you're prepared to make any concessions to maintain that image, then you may adopt different policies. But you have to at least have the intellectual integrity to decide what's your independent variable, what's your point of departure. And if you want to secure Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people, then you have to adopt policies that secure it in the prevailing realities, not in some delusional parallel universe where Churchill is wrong and Chamberlain is right, where pigs are aerodynamic and wolves and leopards are no longer carnivorous, but consort with lambs and goats. You must decide what universe you want your policy to be relevant in. And if you want it to be relevant for the real universe, then they have to be completely different from the policies that have been advocated and applied in the last 2 decades.